Okay, so we're going to have a little look at Henry VII's church, because this was a topic that lots of you have asked me to go over. And I just want to start off by discussing, or just briefly outlining, what is meant by the great chain of being. So it's the belief, you can see there, it's the belief that God set out an order for everything in the universe. On earth, God created a social order for everyone and chose where you belonged. The king or queen is in charge because God put them there, and they were only answerable to God. And this meant, therefore, that disobeying a monarch was a sin. So you can also use this when you're analysing the sort of obedience or lack of obedience during a Tudor rebellion. You can see there on the left what is meant to be a sort of image of the chain of being, with a sort of hell at the bottom, and even things like the trees and the plants having a place in society. Now, the great chain of being is really fundamental to the church. It was a concept in church doctrine, normally taught about at church services, and the chain conveyed contemporary ideas of a God that punished those who rebelled against their king, and to do this was treason. God also punished those who questioned the authority of the church. This was heresy, and therefore this is why the church is a fundamental pillar in maintaining control throughout a kingdom for a Tudor monarch. So what was the church like in 1485? All of the English people belonged theoretically to the Catholic Church and under the authority of the Pope in Rome. The main power was from the Pope. It was seen that the king owned the people of his country under the influence of the Pope. The church in England was split into two provinces, Canterbury and York, and both were under the authority of an archbishop and 17 dioceses, an area under the pastoral care of a bishop in the Christian church, with each of these controlled by a bishop. The church's major ceremonies were the way to monitor lives and the way that people lived. There were over 8,000 parish churches in England, and the focus was on a religious experience. The church made it easy for the political and social elites to maintain social control through the emphasis on good behaviour, obedience, and also to stress the values of a community. The abbots, who were heads of the wealthiest religious houses, shared a membership with the House of Lords, with the bishops. So you can also see there the strong links between church and politics. So an overview of Henry's church. His reign saw the high tide of traditional piety in England. Why? Because his largely peaceful foreign policy minimised the fiscal burden on the population at large, and therefore expenditure on parish worship and on prayers for the dead reached record levels, around 1,500. So after that, if we're thinking about changing continuity in terms of Henry VIII, due to the cost of war and then as a result the onset of the English Reformation, these levels, these figures decreased significantly. So what was religious policy at the time? The church taught that it was a sin, as we've already said, to oppose or rebel against Henry VII. Henry opposed anti-clericalism, and this helped him to gain an ally in the church. Some offices of state were monopolised by clergymen. Henry promoted Bishop Morton to Archbishop and then Lord Chancellor, which was an important advisory role to the king. So again, the link between church and politics. Henry was keen to work closely with the church, as it could be used as a powerful ally if the throne was ever to be challenged. So trying to approach this topic in a more thematic way, the overall theme, the overall aim of Henry VII in terms of his church is that he wanted to use piety as a tool to safeguard his own status. Okay, so heavily links here with consolidation and sort of internal security. If we break that down, he wanted to demonstrate his commitment to the church. He wanted to unify his country. He wanted to improve his revenue. and he also wanted to improve his control over his kingdom, and that also included using the church as a system of rewards for loyalty. In terms of Henry VII's personal views, he was very famously pious. He had an elaborate provision prepared for his soul after his death. In his will, he requested 10,000 masses to be said for his soul, which is a good example of his piety. He didn't share his son's passion for theology. His interest in religion was entirely practical, which doesn't really surprise you about Henry VII, and it was designed purely to get him into heaven. So let's have a little look at one of those sub-themes. First of all, how Henry sought to demonstrate his commitment to the church. First of all, in terms of religious houses, he started off by confirming the recent foundation, which had begun in 1482, of an observant house at Greenwich. And in 1500 he founded another one in Richmond, so both of these were beside his palaces. An observant house where friars lived. And he also encouraged existing Franciscan houses to adopt the observant lifestyle. In 1499, the Observants of England became a province of their order in their own right, numbering 5 houses by the time Henry died. He also endowed a hospital, the Savoy, to help poor and needy people in London. Within his will, he famously built a chapel at the east end of Westminster Abbey at huge expense. So it's a good example of evidence there showing that he wasn't completely against expenditure. He contributed to church building and poor relief, and he was the first English king in 70 years to do this, so to contribute to church building. Continuing on the same theme, after his victory at Stoke in 1487, Henry had donated a splendid votive statue of himself to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham, to which he had been on pilgrimage shortly before embarking on the military campaign that year. And that would have been an outward sign of his devotion and his piety, and particularly at Walsingham, which was a Catholic place of pilgrimage. Throughout his life, he remained a devout and regular pilgrim himself. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury was a particular favourite to which he returned frequently. In his will, he requested a statue identical to that which he had given to Walsingham to be made for the Canterbury shrine. So the piety of Henry VII was displayed in gestures which were made on a truly royal scale, but they were perfectly in tune with the devotional practices of his people, and therefore arguably were very successful. Another less well known but unusual example of Henry VII's piety is to do with St. George. So among Henry's other favourite saints was the patron of England, St. George, and Louis XII of France, who conquered the Duchy of Milan around the turn of the century, found a relic of St. George, a leg, amongst his treasures after the war. In due course, this was actually sent to Henry as a present, and he was so pleased that on St. George's Day in 1505, he arranged and took part in a solemn procession which culminated in the public veneration of the relic, displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral. In his will, Henry bequeathed the leg to the Chapel Royal of St. George at Windsor. So, secondly, he wanted to use the church to unify his country and to increase the control over the kingdom. In attempts to do this, in an attempt to bring unification and a sense of justice, he rationalised some of the ecclesiastical laws, so the laws that applied to the church. He repealed the the law that gave immunity to people from secular courts. And as a result of these changes that he made to the ecclesiastical laws, the number of prosecutions increased, and it was his attempt to deal with any corruption as a result of the old law courts. Henry also wanted to improve his revenue, and a good example of that is he continued an age-old practice of not immediately appointing a bishop when a bishopric fell empty. And the reason that he did that is he could then pocket the money raised in that area while it was vacant. Now, the time limit Henry put on this seems to have been a maximum of 12 months, and by the end of his reign, this process was providing him with £6,000 per year. Now, he also used the church as a reward for loyal supporters, and I think that links quite heavily with wanting to unify or oversee his country and control his country, because he wanted to put people he could trust in positions in the church. The church served as a source of reward for favoured servants and counsellors, and episcopal and church appointments themselves were for the most part of very trusted servants or of their relative. The Stanleys and Audleys did pretty well on the basis of the political influence of their families, but without really doing much in terms of notably raising the intellectual or moral standards that they were presenting in terms of the church. James Stanley was made Bishop of Ely for no better reason than that he was the stepson of the King's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Now, we could counter this by saying that most of Henry's bishops were hard-working, effective administrators, irrespective of whether their primary commitments were to the church or to the crown. The ones I've got listed for you there: Mortimer, Moran, Fox, Ruthall, King, Sherborne, and the rest of the royal servants who were awarded were extremely capable and hard-working individuals. So just to have a think about the critics of the church. The church had both supporters and critics. The church and its clergymen were undoubtedly wealthy and powerful, and humanist thinkers criticised this on the grounds that in the Bible, the original church was supposed to be poor and its priests were supposed to be humble. They criticised the church for its corruption and exploitation of people's fear of what would happen to their souls after the death, and particularly the practice of the sale of indulgences, where you donated money to the church and you bought what was called an indulgence, and the idea was to help your soul get to heaven. The church was seen to be out of touch. Services in Latin meant that ordinary worshippers could not understand what was being said, while the worship of saints was seen to be superstitious and not biblical. Many clergymen held multiple posts. This is known as pluralism, which meant that they had little contact with the people they were supposed to be serving. And this antagonism towards the church is often called anti-clericalism. Another problem within the church came from the Lollards. It was a key idea which actually originated in the medieval period, and it originated in the 1380s. And their aim was to reform the Catholic Church. The stress on reading the Bible by ordinary people, which they believed should have been encouraged, and they minimised the importance of the priesthood, the sacraments, and they also questioned transubstantiation. 73 suspects were tried in church courts during Henry VII's reign. Only 11 were burned for their crimes. So they were present, they weren't hugely dangerous, but they were being tried. So that shows that Henry VII to a degree was dealing with those threats. But it's really important that we don't overplay the significance of this organisation or this group at this point. Okay, just to finish off, like all things, is Henry VII's policy to the church the same all the way through? He has much more of a consistent he has a relatively consistent policy, much more so if you think comparatively to his son, but there is some degree of change. When he himself fell dangerously ill in 1504, 1 year after the death of his wife and 2 years after the death of his eldest son, he experienced what was called a spiritual awakening. He repented his ruthless fiscal exploitation of the church. He vowed to appoint only worthy and devout men as bishops. And he did do this by his choice of John Fisher, a spiritual director to his mother, when he made him Bishop of Rochester. So there's an extract there from a letter which he actually wrote to his mother when he was ill. And it's interesting there that he said, "I have in my days promoted many a man unadvisedly." So I think it's really good evidence to show that Henry VII would have been the first really to admit or to acknowledge the fact that he's using the church as a tool to strengthen his position, to gain control of his kingdom, gain revenue, reward supporters. However, after his sickness, upon his recovery, the vow was forgotten, and as far as the church was concerned, for the last part of his reign, it was business as usual, and he quickly returned back to using the church as a system of control, rather than trying to appoint the right and holy people for the jobs.